Welcome to Lady Mythos. Apollo was the god of light, and yet he was also the reason entire cities fell into plague, the reason prophecies destroyed lives, the reason even kings feared being noticed by him. And that contradiction is where his story begins. Because in ancient Greece, people did not pray to Apollo for comfort. They prayed carefully. Tonight, we step into a world where light does not warm you, it exposes you. Where truth is not given to guide you, but arrives when it is already too late to change anything. And at the center of that world stands a god most people think they understand. Apollo, the radiant one, the beautiful one, the god of music, healing, prophecy, and light. But that is only half the story. Because Apollo does not rage like Ares. He does not destroy like Zeus. He does something much quieter. He decides. And once he does, things don't fall apart all at once. They unfold, slowly, precisely, exactly as they were always going to. A plague appears, without warning. A prophecy is spoken, and only makes sense when everything is already lost. A single arrow is released, and lands exactly where it needs to. And the most unsettling part? Apollo does not lie. He does not deceive. He tells the truth and lets the world destroy itself, trying to understand it. So tonight, we ask a simple question. Was Apollo truly the god of light? Or was he something far more dangerous? A god of clarity, a god of inevitability, a god who reveals, but never rescues. Because once you follow his story, a pattern begins to form. A mother cast out by the world, a child born into rejection, a god who would not grow to forgive that injustice, but to correct it. Again, and again, and again. Through monsters slain, through lovers lost, through mortals broken, through truths no one could escape. And somewhere along that path, the god of light became something else entirely. So as the night settles in, and the world around you begins to quiet, let the rain fall softly beyond the trees, and come a little closer. Because this is not just the story of Apollo. It is the story of what happens when truth is given without mercy. And by the end of this journey, you may find yourself wondering not whether Apollo was kind, but whether anyone who truly sees clearly can ever be. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn into these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, do you think Apollo is fair? Or do you think he's dangerous? Now, close your eyes or follow the path before you, and let's return to a time before Apollo was worshipped, before he was feared, to the moment the world itself refused to let him be born. Chapter 1. Why the world refused Apollo's birth. Before Apollo became a god, people prayed to. Before temples, before prophecies, before all of that, there was just his mother, trying to find somewhere to stop. You already know part of this story. You've seen what happened to Leto, how the world turned her away, how no land would accept her, how even the gods stayed silent. And if you want the full version, it's linked above. But for now, we only need to remember one thing. Apollo was not born into welcome. He was born into rejection. Leto had nowhere to go. Every place she reached refused her. Not because she had done something wrong, but because of who she carried. And no one wanted to face the consequences of helping her. So she kept moving, day after day, until she reached something that barely counted as land at all. A small, floating island. Delos. It wasn't fixed to the earth. It didn't belong to anyone, which meant it wasn't bound by Hera's rule. Even then, it hesitated. Because there were already rumors about the child Leto carried, that he would not be like the others. But in the end, Delos gave her just enough space to stop. The birth was not quick. Hera made sure of that. The goddess of childbirth was kept away, and without her, the labor stretched on far longer than it should have. It became something Leto simply had to endure. Artemis was born first, and even as a child, she seemed aware of what was happening. Some stories say she helped her mother through the rest of the birth. And then, Apollo was born. There was no dramatic sign, no thunder, no great light. But something changed. Quietly, but completely. Because the world that had refused him could not undo what had just happened. And Apollo did not enter the world weak. In many tellings, he grows almost immediately, as if he doesn't need time to become what he is, as if he already understands the world he's been born into. And Delos, the place that no one wanted, becomes one of the most important places in Greece. Not because of what it was, but because of who was born there. That matters, because Apollo's story doesn't begin with power. It begins with something else. He sees what happened to his mother. He sees how the world works, who is allowed in and who is pushed out. And he learns something very early. The world doesn't run on fairness. It runs on power and fear. And Apollo doesn't grow up trying to change that. He grows up understanding it. Not far from where he was born, something older still existed. Something that had been there long before Apollo. Something tied to a different kind of power. Not controlled, not structured. A serpent, deep in the earth, waiting. And when Apollo takes his first real action, it won't be about proving himself. It won't be about anger. It will be about something much more deliberate. Setting things in order. Because the child the world refused is about to decide what the world should look like. And the first thing he chooses to do is go after something ancient enough to have ruled before him. Chapter 2: Apollo versus Python, the kill that changed the gods. Apollo does not wait long. He is not a god who spends years learning or slowly growing into power. From the beginning, he understands what he is meant to do. And the first place he turns to is a place that already holds power of its own. At the center of the Greek world, beneath the slopes of Mount Parnassus, there was something ancient, something older than Olympus, older than Apollo. A serpent. Python. Apollo didn't just kill Python. He replaced the way truth worked in the world. This was not just a monster. That's important to understand. Python was tied to the earth itself, to an older kind of prophecy, one that didn't speak clearly, it didn't guide, it didn't explain. It overwhelmed. Visions came in fragments. Truth came without structure. It was powerful, but uncontrolled. And that kind of power had no place in Apollo's world. Because Apollo is not a god of chaos. He is a god of order, of structure, of clarity. And the world, as he sees it, needs to reflect that. So he goes to Delphi, alone. No warning, no negotiation. The air there feels different, heavy, still, as if something beneath the ground is breathing, watching, waiting. Python is already there, coiled deep within the earth, guarding the place where the old voice of prophecy once rose. A place where truth came from the ground itself, unfiltered, uncontrolled. Apollo doesn't speak. He doesn't announce himself. He raises his bow, and he begins. The first arrow cuts through the air, then another, and another. Python rises, massive. The ground shifts as it moves, scales catching what little light reaches into the cavern. It doesn't retreat. It doesn't hesitate. Because until this moment, nothing had ever threatened it. Apollo keeps firing, not wildly, not in panic. Every shot is placed, measured, deliberate. The serpent strikes back. The space between them closes quickly. This is not distant anymore. This is close, dangerous. But Apollo does not lose control. He watches. He adjusts. He waits for the moment that matters. And then, 2 arrows, released together. One finds the eye, the other, a weaker point beneath the scales. Python falters. The movement slows. The strength begins to fail. Apollo steps forward, not rushing, not hesitating. And the final arrow ends it. Silence. The serpent collapses back into the earth, and with it, something else disappears. An older voice, an older kind of power. Gone. But this was never just about killing a creature. This was something else entirely. Apollo has just done something no one can ignore. He hasn't just defeated a monster. he has replaced something. The way truth works in the world has changed. Before Apollo, truth came from the earth, raw, uncontrolled, difficult to understand. After Apollo, truth would be given differently, structured, measured, controlled. And that shift changes everything. But there's a problem. Python was not just dangerous, it was sacred, connected to Gaia, to the earth itself. And killing something sacred has consequences, even for a god. Apollo knows this, and for the first time, he doesn't act above the rules. He submits to them. He leaves Delphi. He undergoes purification, because even he understands something important. You cannot create order by ignoring the cost of what you destroy. When he returns, Delphi is no longer what it was. The serpent is gone, the old voice is gone, and now the place is empty, waiting. Apollo steps into that silence, and instead of letting prophecy rise freely, he changes it. From now on, truth will not come from the earth. It will come through him, through a single voice, a single place, a single system. At Delphi, a priestess will sit above the sacred ground, and when she speaks, it will be Apollo speaking through her. But there is one thing he will never change. He will not explain. He will give answers, but never guidance. Truth, but never clarity on how to escape it. And over time, kings, warriors, entire cities will come to him, looking for certainty, and leave with something much more dangerous. Because once Apollo speaks, the outcome is already set, and the only thing left is watching it happen. The serpent is gone, the silence is filled, and Apollo is no longer just a god born into a broken world. He is now the one who decides how that world works. But if there is one thing Apollo has not learned yet, it's this. Controlling truth is not the same as controlling what people do with it. And very soon, that difference will begin to show. Chapter 3. Why Apollo's punishment was worse than death. By now, Apollo has established something. He doesn't need to prove his strength. He doesn't need to raise his voice. When he acts, things change. And people begin to understand something about him. Apollo is not unpredictable. He is not chaotic. He is consistent. And that makes him dangerous. Because once you understand the pattern, you also understand there are no exceptions. Apollo does not punish out of anger. He doesn't punish people. He rewrites what they become. He punishes when something crosses a line. And once that line is crossed, the outcome is already decided. There is no arguing with him, no bargaining, no second chances. And the punishments he gives don't end quickly. They stay. One of the clearest examples of this begins with something simple. Pride. There was a queen, Niobe, Powerful, respected, surrounded by everything she believed proved her worth. She had many children, sons and daughters who filled her halls with life. And that was enough for her to believe something dangerous, that she was greater than a goddess. Not through strength, not through power, but through comparison. She looked at Leto, Apollo's mother, and she saw someone with only 2 children. And she said it out loud. Why should Leto be honored? Why should people worship her? What had she done that Niobe herself had not done better? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm, confident, and that's what made it worse. Because Apollo hears it immediately, and just like before, he doesn't respond with anger. He doesn't appear in front of her. He doesn't warn her. He decides. Artemis stands with him, as she always does, and together they act. Apollo takes the sons. Artemis takes the daughters. The arrows are fast, precise. Each one placed exactly where it needs to be. No chaos, no struggle. One by one, the children fall. And when it's over, Niobe is still alive. Death would have ended it. Apollo makes sure it continues. That is the punishment. Because Apollo does not always take everything. Sometimes he leaves just enough behind for the weight of what's been done to remain. Niobe doesn't argue anymore. She doesn't speak. She doesn't compare. She breaks. And in some tellings, she turns to stone, frozen in grief, tears still falling long after everything else has stopped. Apollo does not return. He does not undo it. Because from his perspective, nothing was done incorrectly. The line was crossed. The balance was restored. And that's the pattern. But Niobe's story is only one version of it. There are others. A man named Marsyas, gifted, talented, a musician who believed his skill was enough to stand beside a god. He challenged Apollo, not out of hatred, but out of confidence. And for a moment, it almost worked. The music was strong, wild, different. But Apollo is not just skill, he is structure. And when the contest ends, there is no debate. Apollo wins. And what follows is not quick. Marsyas is bound, and slowly his skin is taken from him. Not in rage, not in chaos, in control. Because again, the line had been crossed. And Apollo does not ignore that. Even in love, it's the same. Cassandra, given the gift of prophecy, able to see what no one else could. But when she refuses him, Apollo does not take the gift away. He changes it. She will always speak the truth, and no one will ever believe her. She watches everything unfold, every disaster, every death, every mistake, knowing exactly what will happen and unable to stop any of it. That is Apollo's punishment. Not silence, not ignorance. Awareness without power. And this is where something becomes clear. Apollo doesn't just punish actions, he changes outcomes. He takes something that already exists and turns it into something else. Love becomes distance. Talent becomes warning. Truth becomes a burden. And once that change is made, it doesn't go back. That's why his punishment feels worse than death. Because death ends something. Apollo's punishments continue. They stay in the world, in memory, in symbols. A grieving mother turned to stone. A river named after a man who lost everything. A woman who sees the future and is never believed. These are not endings. They are reminders. And that's the point. Because Apollo is not trying to destroy people. He is making sure no one forgets what happens when the line is crossed. But there is something Apollo still hasn't learned. There are some things that don't come from arrogance. Some things don't cross a line on purpose. And when that happens, his kind of judgment becomes something else entirely. Because the next time Apollo causes loss, it won't be correction. It will be personal. Chapter 4. Why everyone Apollo loved was destroyed. There is something about Apollo that becomes clear over time. He understands the world. He understands order, consequences, boundaries. But there is one thing he never fully learns how to handle: closeness. Because when Apollo wants something, he does not approach it lightly. He focuses on it completely. And that kind of attention, from a god like him, changes things. It doesn't stay simple. It doesn't stay human. It becomes something else. And almost every time, it ends the same way. It begins with Daphne. She is not looking for a god. She is not trying to be noticed. She wants something simple. Distance. Freedom. But Apollo sees her, and something shifts. Not gradually, not carefully, instantly. In some tellings, it's Eros who causes it. A single arrow, and Apollo is overwhelmed with desire. But what matters is not how it starts, it's how it unfolds. Apollo doesn't hesitate. He follows her. Through forests, across riverbanks, closer and closer. And the entire time, he speaks. Not threatening, not cruel. Certain. He tells her who he is, what he can offer, why she should stop running. But Daphne understands something he doesn't. Being chosen by a god is not the same as being loved. It means being claimed. And she doesn't want that. So she keeps running, until there is nowhere left to go. And in that moment, she makes a choice. Not to escape, but to disappear. She calls to her father, and her body begins to change. Her feet root into the ground, her skin hardens, her arms stretch into branches. This is the closest Apollo ever gets to something he cannot keep. And just as Apollo reaches her, she is gone. A tree. He stops. Too late. And for once, he does not try to undo it. He can't. So instead, he changes what remains. The laurel tree becomes sacred, a symbol of victory, of honor. And from that point on, every triumph is tied to something he lost. That's the pattern. Apollo doesn't restore what's gone. He transforms it into something that lasts. But that doesn't mean it doesn't cost him, because Daphne is not the only one. There is Hyacinthus. With him, things are different. There is no pursuit, no resistance, just time, shared moments, training together, competing, laughing. For once, Apollo is not chasing something. He already has it. And maybe that's why this one matters more. Because it ends just as suddenly. A game. A discus thrown into the air. Clean. Perfect. Hyacinthus runs to catch it, and something shifts. A gust of wind. A change in direction. The discus comes down and strikes him. There is no time to react, no way to correct it. Apollo reaches him, but it's already done. And for the first time, nothing he is helps. No prophecy, no healing, no control. Just the moment, and the realization that he cannot change it. Hyacinthus dies, and for the first time, Apollo cannot correct what just happened. And Apollo does the only thing he can. He doesn't bring him back. He turns him into something that remains. A flower. Every year, it returns. A reminder, but not a solution. Because for Apollo, this is new. This isn't punishment. This isn't correction. This is loss that follows no rule he can enforce. And that's what unsettles him. Because everything Apollo understands about the world depends on cause and consequence, lines that are crossed, outcomes that follow. But here, there was no line. And still, the result is the same. Something is taken, and it doesn't come back. There are others too. Cassandra, given the gift of prophecy, able to see everything clearly, but when she refuses him, he changes the outcome. She keeps the truth, but loses the ability to make anyone believe it. She becomes trapped inside her own knowledge, watching everything unfold, unable to stop it. Again, Apollo doesn't take something away. He reshapes it. And once it's changed, it stays that way. And when you look at all of it together, a pattern forms. Daphne becomes a tree. Hyacinthus becomes a flower. Cassandra becomes a voice no one listens to. They don't disappear completely. They become symbols. And that's what Apollo does. He turns moments into something permanent. But permanence is not the same as healing. And this is where something important shifts. Apollo begins to understand something he hadn't needed to before. Not everything that is lost can be explained. Not everything follows a rule. And not everything can be corrected. But he hasn't reached the limit of that yet. Because the next time loss comes into his life, It won't be distant. It won't be symbolic. It will be something he cannot step away from. And when that happens, the god who enforces order will finally face something he cannot control. Chapter 5. Oracle of Delphi. Why Apollo never told the truth. After Python is gone, Delphi changes. Not all at once, but completely. Before Apollo, this place belonged to something older. Truth came from the ground, uncontrolled, difficult to understand, impossible to shape. After Apollo, that changes. He doesn't destroy prophecy, he reorganizes it. From now on, truth will not rise freely. It will be given on his terms. At Delphi, a single voice is chosen, a priestess. She sits above the sacred ground, breathing in what rises from below. And when she speaks, it is no longer just her voice. It is Apollo. People begin to come. At first, slowly, then in numbers that never really stop. Kings, generals, leaders, anyone who needs certainty, because that's what they believe Apollo offers. Certainty. But that's not what they receive. They come with questions. Simple ones. Clear ones. Should we go to war? Should we build here? Should we trust this person? And Apollo answers, but never the way they expect. He doesn't explain. He doesn't guide. He states. And that's the problem. Apollo doesn't guide people. He watches them choose wrong. A sentence, a phrase, sometimes only a few words, and then nothing. No clarification, no warning, just the truth. And that's where the problem begins. Because Apollo never lies, but he also never makes things easy to understand. And over time, a pattern forms. A king asks if he should go to war. Apollo answers in a way that sounds like victory. So he goes, and loses everything. Another asks if he should trust an ally. Apollo gives an answer that could mean either outcome. So he chooses to believe what he wants, and is betrayed. Again and again, the same thing happens. The prophecy is given. It is misunderstood. And in the attempt to avoid it, it comes true. Apollo does not correct them. He doesn't step in. He doesn't clarify what he meant. Because from his perspective, he already told the truth. What people do with it is not his responsibility. And that's what makes Delphi different. It is not a place that protects people. It is a place that reveals outcomes and leaves people to deal with them. Over time, Delphi becomes the center of the Greek world, not because it offers comfort, but because it offers something more dangerous. Answers. Even if those answers lead to destruction. And Apollo remains distant. He does not appear. He does not argue. He speaks once and waits. Because he understands something most people don't. Knowing the future does not mean you can change it. And sometimes, trying to change it is exactly what causes it. That's the part people struggle with. They come to Apollo thinking he will guide them, but that's never what he does. He doesn't guide. He reveals. And once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. That's why his truth feels like deception. Not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. And people fill in the rest with what they want to believe. And Apollo lets them, because to him, that is part of the process. Truth is given, choice follows, and consequence comes after. Always. This is how Apollo controls the world without force. He doesn't need to fight. He only needs to speak and wait. But there is something this kind of power creates. Distance. Because a god who never explains himself is not a god people understand. And eventually, that distance leads to something else. Not fear, not yet, but resistance. Because the more people rely on Apollo's words, the more they begin to realize they are not being helped. They are being tested. And very soon, that will stop being subtle. Because when Apollo steps into human conflict directly, he will no longer just reveal outcomes. He will enforce them.
Chapter 6. How Apollo controlled the Trojan War. When the Trojan War begins, most people think they understand what kind of conflict it is. A war of heroes, of glory, of strength. Gods take sides. Athena supports the Greeks. Ares moves with the chaos of battle. Hera pushes events forward. It looks loud, unpredictable, driven by emotion. But Apollo does not move like that. He watches from a distance. Because Apollo is not interested in who is stronger. He is interested in whether things are unfolding the way they should. And very early in the war, something doesn't sit right. The Greeks begin to act as if the gods are beneath them, as if victory is something they can take, rather than something that must remain aligned. And that's when Apollo steps in. Not onto the battlefield, but into the space around it. The offense itself is small. Agamemnon refuses to return a captive woman taken from one of Apollo's priests. It's not dramatic, not unusual for war. But that's not the point. A boundary has been crossed. And Apollo responds the only way he ever does. He raises his bow and releases. But the arrows do not strike soldiers. They strike something else. The air. And from that, something spreads. Quietly. A sickness. Men begin to fall, not from wounds, but from something they cannot fight. There is no battle to win, no enemy to strike, only time. And the slow realization that this is not random. This is controlled. The camp begins to weaken. Fires burn day and night, not for warmth, but for bodies. And only when Agamemnon gives in does it stop, just as quietly as it began. That's how Apollo enters the war, not with force, but with correction. And from that point on, he doesn't need to stay visible.
because he doesn't need to. Apollo doesn't fight battles. He decides outcomes. Throughout the war, he appears only when something needs to be adjusted. A warrior who should not fall yet is protected. An arrow that needs to land is guided. In some tellings, he stands beside Paris, not speaking, not commanding, just steadying the moment. And the arrow flies, not into armor, but into a single point. Even the greatest warrior in Greece only falls when Apollo allows it. Achilles, the strongest warrior of the age, does not fall in a great clash. He falls because the moment arrives exactly when it is supposed to. That's Apollo's influence. Not dramatic, not loud, final. Even his loyalty in the war reflects this. He supports Troy, but not because of emotion, not because of attachment, because their fall has not yet reached its time. So he protects them until that changes. And when it does, he withdraws just as easily. No resistance, no protest. Because Apollo does not prevent endings. He ensures they happen correctly. That's what makes him different from the other gods. Ares thrives in chaos. Athena shapes strategy. Apollo waits, and then places a single action at exactly the right moment. And that one action can shift everything. Years of war reduced to a few decisions, a few moments, a few arrows. That's control. And that's why Apollo never needs to dominate a battlefield, because he doesn't need to win the war. He only needs to decide when it ends. But even for a god like Apollo, there are limits. There are moments when the outcome is not something he can simply place, because the next loss he faces will not belong to kings or warriors or cities. It will belong to him. And when that happens, the control he has always relied on will begin to break. Chapter 7. The only time Apollo lost control. Up to this point, Apollo has been consistent, measured, deliberate, in control. Everything he does follows a pattern. A line is crossed, a decision is made, an outcome follows. Even when the result is harsh, it makes sense. But there is one moment in his story where that pattern breaks, and it begins with someone he does not want to lose. Coronis. She is not like the others, not distant, not unreachable. She chooses him, and for once, Apollo does not have to pursue. He does not have to convince. It is simple. She becomes pregnant with his child, and for a moment, it looks like something in Apollo's life might remain unchanged. But Apollo sees too much, whether through prophecy or through the eyes of something sent to watch. He learns the truth. Coronis has been unfaithful. The knowledge reaches him quietly. No confrontation, no argument. And just like every other time, Apollo decides. She is condemned. In some tellings, he sins Artemis. In others, he acts himself. But the outcome is the same.
Coronis dies. And at first, that is where the story should end. A line crossed, a consequence delivered, order restored. But something is different, because this time, Apollo looks closer. Too late. Coronis is already on the funeral pyre, and only then does he realize what else is being destroyed. The child. His child. And for the first time, Apollo does something he has never done before. He interrupts the outcome. He steps into the fire and pulls the child from her body. Alive. The damage is not undone. Coronis is gone. But something remains. The child is taken away, raised, taught. This child becomes Asclepius, and unlike Apollo, his power moves in a different direction. He does not enforce order. He restores. He heals. At first, this fits within the world Apollo understands. Healing is balance, restoring what has been damaged. But Asclepius does not stop there. He goes further. He begins to do something no one is meant to do. He brings the dead back. Not once, not by accident, repeatedly. And this crosses a line. Not Apollo's, Zeus's. Because death is not something meant to be reversed. And when that boundary is broken, Zeus responds. A single strike, and Asclepius is gone. Killed instantly. This time, Apollo is not the one making the decision. He is the one receiving it. And the reaction is immediate. There is no pause, no distance, no control. Apollo turns his anger outward. Not at Zeus. He cannot challenge him. So he chooses something else. The Cyclopes. The ones who forged the thunderbolt. The ones who made the weapon that killed his son. And Apollo kills them. Not as correction, not as balance, as revenge. This is not Apollo correcting the world. This is Apollo breaking it. And that is the difference. For the first time, Apollo acts without structure. There is no line being restored, no rule being enforced, only loss and a response to it. That's why this moment matters, because it reveals something about Apollo that had never been visible before. He is not separate from what he controls. He is part of it. And when the outcome turns against him, he reacts. Just like anyone else. Zeus does not ignore this, because this time, Apollo is the one who has crossed the line. And the punishment that follows will not be quick. It will not be symbolic. It will be something Apollo has never experienced before. Limits. Because for the first time, the god who decides outcomes will have to live inside one. And that is where something begins to change. Because losing control once is enough to show you something you cannot unsee. That order is not absolute, and that even a god like Apollo is not outside of it. Chapter 8.
when Zeus made Apollo mortal. Apollo has crossed a line, not quietly, not carefully. For the first time, he acted without control. The Cyclopes are dead, and Zeus knows exactly who did it. There is no confusion, no misunderstanding. Apollo has broken the order he enforces. And Zeus does not respond with anger. He responds with something much more precise. A punishment that does not destroy Apollo, but changes his position. He is sent away, not cast into darkness, not stripped of his power completely, but placed somewhere he has never truly been before, among mortals. Apollo is made to serve. For the first time, Apollo is not above the outcome. He is inside it. Not rule, not decide. Serve. He is sent to the household of a king, Admetus, and for a time, the god who shaped outcomes from a distance must live inside one. The days are different. There are no prophecies to deliver, no judgments to enforce, no distance between him and the world. He tends to animals. He follows routine. He waits. Time moves differently here, not in moments of decision, but in repetition. And something unexpected happens. Nothing breaks. No lines are crossed. No punishment is needed. Because Admetus does not treat him with fear. He treats him with respect, not knowing exactly what Apollo is, but understanding enough not to challenge it. And Apollo notices, because this is new. Order without enforcement. Things work, not because they are forced into place, but because they are allowed to remain there. The land becomes fertile. The animals thrive, not because Apollo commands it, but because he is present. And for the first time, Apollo sees a different version of balance, one that doesn't require correction. But that doesn't mean he stops being who he is. When Admetus faces death, Apollo intervenes. Not by breaking the rules, but by bending them. He goes to the fates and makes an arrangement. Admetus can live if someone else is willing to take his place. It is not mercy, it is an exchange, a condition. And when the moment comes, no one steps forward. Not his friends, not his people, only his wife. She accepts. And just like that, the outcome shifts again. Apollo does not force it. He does not interfere further. He creates the possibility and lets the world respond. That's the difference now. Before, Apollo decided outcomes. Now, he allows them to unfold within limits. And that changes something. Because this time, he sees the result up close. What it costs. What people choose when they are the ones who have to carry it. And when his time among mortals ends, Apollo returns. Still the same god, still exact, still controlled, but not unchanged. Because he has seen something he did not understand before. That order does not always need to be imposed. Sometimes it exists on its own, and sometimes it depends on what people are willing to give up. That understanding stays with him, but it doesn't make him softer. It makes him more aware, because now he knows what it feels like to live inside the consequences he creates. And that knowledge will shape what comes next. Because even with everything he has learned, there are still lines that cannot be crossed. And when they are, Apollo will still respond the same way. But now, he understands the cost. And that makes his judgment even more deliberate. Chapter 9. Apollo explained what the god of light really is. By the time most people think they understand Apollo, they are already looking at the end of his story. A calm figure, a beautiful god, associated with light, music, healing, sometimes even reduced to something simple, the sun. But that's not where Apollo begins, and it's not really what he is. In earlier traditions, the sun was something else entirely, a force that moved across the sky on its own, relentless, unstoppable. Apollo was never that. He was something quieter. He does not burn, he reveals, and that is far more dangerous. He reveals, and that difference matters. Because when people call Apollo the god of light, they often imagine warmth, comfort, clarity that helps. But Apollo's kind of light does something else. It exposes. It shows things as they are, without softening them, without explaining them. And that's what connects everything in his story. The serpent at Delphi, the punishments, the prophecies, the people he loved. None of it is random. It all follows the same idea. Things must be seen clearly, even if that clarity causes damage. That's why his domains seem so different, but are actually connected. Music, not just sound, but structure, balance, harmony that follows rules. Prophecy, not guidance, but outcome, a statement of what will happen, whether you understand it or not. Healing, not kindness, but restoration, returning something to the way it should be. And when that fails, disease, because both come from the same place. Correction. Even his arrows follow this pattern. They do not strike wildly. They land exactly where they are meant to. And when they do, the result is final. That's why Apollo feels different from the other gods. He doesn't represent emotion. He represents alignment. Things being in the right place. And when they are not, he changes them. That's the core of who he is. Not a protector, not a destroyer, a corrector. And that's also why people misunderstand him. Because from a distance, order looks like peace. But up close, it can be harsh. Because correction does not ask if you are ready for it. It happens. And you deal with what comes after. That's what Apollo does. He doesn't guide people away from mistakes. He lets them happen, and then ensures the outcome follows. That's why his prophecies feel like traps, not because they are false, but because they are complete. They don't change to help you. You change, trying to deal with them. And in doing so, you often bring them to life. Apollo doesn't interfere with that, because to him, that is the process working exactly as it should. And when you look back at everything, the pattern holds. His mother was rejected, so he ensures rejection has consequences. The world lacked structure, so he imposes it. People misunderstand truth, so he gives it without explanation. And when something breaks that balance, he corrects it. Every time. That's why Apollo is not easy to place. He is not kind, but he is not cruel either. He is consistent. And in a world where most things are uncertain, that kind of consistency can feel overwhelming, because it leaves no space to hide, no room to avoid what is coming. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. Is Apollo the god of light? Yes, but not the kind people hope for. He is the light that reveals everything, whether you are ready to see it or not. And once you've seen it, you don't get to go back. That is what Apollo really is. And that is why he is remembered. Not just as a god of beauty or music or the sun, but as something much harder to face. A god who shows the truth and leaves you to live with it. Epilogue. Why Apollo still terrifies us today. Apollo's story doesn't really end, not in the way other myths do. There's no final battle, no fall, no moment where everything closes. Because what Apollo represents doesn't disappear. It carries forward. At first, people began to soften him. Over time, he became easier to look at. A god of music, of beauty, of light in its gentler form. The kind of figure you could admire without feeling uncomfortable. But that version is incomplete. Because the older version of Apollo never went away. It just became quieter. You can still see it if you look closely. Anytime truth appears without comfort. Anytime a decision leads to consequences that can't be undone. Anytime something becomes clear and there's no way to avoid what comes next. That's where Apollo still exists. Not as a figure, but as a pattern. In the real world, we don't call it prophecy. We call it knowledge. We don't call it punishment. We call it consequence. But the structure is the same. We learn something. We ignore it or misunderstand it. And then we face the result. Just like those who stood at Delphi. And that's why Apollo still feels relevant. Because he reflects something uncomfortable. That clarity does not always help. Sometimes it forces you to act. And sometimes it shows you something you would rather not see. There's also another side to him that still carries forward. Apollo was not limited in the way people often expect. In his stories, he loved both women and men. Daphne, Cassandra, Hyacinthus. Not in the way modern labels would define it, but without restriction. And today, that part of him is often remembered differently. Some see him as a symbol of fluidity, of something that does not fit into a single category. And that makes sense, because Apollo has never been simple. He does not stay in one role. He moves between them. Light and disease, healing and destruction, beauty and distance. And that complexity is part of why he remains difficult to fully understand. But more than anything, what stays with people is not what Apollo gives, it's what he doesn't. He does not comfort. He does not guide. He reveals. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be undone. And then steps back, leaving you with what you now know. And that's where the discomfort comes from. Because once something is clear, you are the one who has to respond to it, not him. That's why Apollo still feels unsettling. Not because he is present, but because the idea he represents never really leaves. So if you've stayed with this story until the end, you've seen all of it. Not just the beauty, but the pattern behind it. And maybe now, the question from the beginning feels different. Not whether Apollo is good or bad, but whether a world without him would be better. Or if without that kind of clarity, nothing would ever truly make sense at all. If you made it this far, let me know what you think. Do you see Apollo as a god who brings order, or a god who takes something away? And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for listening to me. For now, let the story settle. Let the noise fade. And when you're ready, we'll step into another myth. Together. Yours, Lady Mythos.